So, welcome to the Agile Architecture Maturity tutorial. I'm going to put you guys to work. I hope that was clear in the description, right? And I'm going to ask you to basically assess the maturity of your own team. And I understand also that there might be a level of sensitivity there. And I have talked to Michelle about the recording of this session. And we are going to not put anything, any of your results that can be traced back to you or your organization in the final cut of the recording. So don't worry about that. And we'll see how we deal with that. Maybe we won't put any recording up at all. But okay, we are still getting more guests in. So welcome, you guys. I'll just first do the short introduction. So, first of all, who of you attended my talk yesterday? Oh, no, wrong question. Who did not attend my talk yesterday? Okay, so we have a few people. So, what you missed was the whole background of this and why it was good and how we applied it and what were the results. All of that you have to take for granted. It's good stuff, right? It worked for us. So we're diving directly into the content, but for those of you who did attend yesterday's session, I do have to explain a little bit, of course, the structure of the model that we are applying, so we can't skip over that. So there's a little bit of duplication there for you. This is also the same slide as yesterday. You can see some of my hobbies, and I am the architecture practice lead in a big IT services company. Globally, it's called CGI. We have 70,000 employees all over the world. And I did some work on research into architecture practices, and I am the founder and owner of the risk and cost-driven architecture approach. As I explained yesterday already, why do we have a maturity model, and why would you be interested in being assessed or assessing yourself on a maturity model? Well, there's basically two reasons for that. The first one is to identify where you can do better. And the second one is when you start making or trying to improve, that you can measure your improvement by reassessing yourself and comparing it to the baseline that you originally did. So that's the why of this whole exercise. And the model that we are using is based on what we call the 5 responsibilities of the architecture function. So these are 5 things that architecture should do. I'm not saying that the architect should do, because not all organizations have architects. But all organizations that are producing or designing and producing software-intensive systems, they need to do architecture, or at least what we call architecture. And that means that they have to somehow make decisions that lead to models, and that are fed by models. And that in order to be able to do that, they have to understand the context of what they're doing, because architecture is context. Everything you do as an architect depends on the context. In contrast to the designer, who can make a lot of design decisions, the regular designer can make a lot of design decisions based on good design principles. The architect cannot get away with that. He always has to understand and be able to trace back his decisions to the particular context that they're working in. And then once you have made the decisions and you have your models of your architecture, those have to be validated, and actually they also have to be executed. And those are the 5 responsibilities of the architecture function. Whether you have assigned all of those responsibilities to one person and you call that person the architect, or maybe you have a team of people and some are better at modeling and some are better at decision making, as long as there is enough collaboration between them, that should work. Where does the modeling come from? Well, that is, I guess, the classical view of architecture, architecture as an abstraction, architecture as a set of structures that you need to reason about the decisions that you're making. The decision making comes from the view of architecture as a set of design decisions, which came a little bit later than the idea of architecture as a modeling discipline. And then the validation and the fulfillment, they are more related to the view of architecture as a risk and cost management discipline, which among others George Fairbanks and myself have been writing quite a lot about. So that is the model of the 5 responsibilities of the architecture function. And the whole maturity model is based on organizations being able to fulfill those responsibilities in a balanced way. So that's what we're going to measure, whether your organization is fulfilling those responsibilities in a balanced way. There are very many ways to do this wrong. And I just would like to point out 2 extremes of doing it wrong. And one of them is the waterfall wasteland, where we completely ignore the right-hand side of this model. We don't make decisions, we only advise management, right? This is the ivory tower architect in the waterfall wasteland. They make designs. They don't worry about the execution that's left to others, right? So this is a very clear demarcation of their responsibility. Unfortunately, it does not always lead to the desired results, especially not in an organization that also tries to be agile. The other extreme is the agile outback, where we are ignoring the left-hand side of this model. We don't do modeling because the best architectures emerge from self-organizing teams, right? That's what it says in the Agile Manifesto, page 2. And maybe if we would do modeling, we would interfere with this magical process of architecture emergence, right? Or we might anger the agile gods. So we don't do modeling, maybe a little bit in secret behind closed doors, as George Fairbanks calls it. And validating, of course not. That's just a waste of time because you learn, the fastest way to learn is actually by doing and making mistakes. Fail early and fail often. So we don't validate. And now, of course, that might be a correct attitude, but in some circumstances, like self-driving vehicles, for example, maybe failing early and failing often is not such a good proposition. So we are striving towards a balanced fulfillment of these 5 responsibilities. And basically what we're saying is an organization's architecture function is mature if it pays balanced attention to all 5 of them, and if they are coherent and related to each other. Of course, it doesn't make any sense if one person understands the context, but another person makes all the decisions. Right? It sounds very illogical, but it happens in a lot of situations. Because there's just too many layers in between here, too many indirections. Or that the decisions and the models have nothing to do with each other, or the models are made but they're not validated, they're just executed, etc. So all of this has to be coherent and corresponding to each other. So these 5 responsibilities we have mapped to a number of behaviors. Now I know in the abstract it says 11 behaviors, but that was version 0.1 of the model. And in the meantime, since writing the abstract in January, because that was the deadline for submitting a talk to this conference, we actually have evolved the model a little bit. So we are now at 5, 8, 10, 13 behaviors. And basically this is where I stopped yesterday. Well, then I told people of how we had applied it and why and what the result was. All of that you can look at the video after the conference. What we are going to do here in this room is we are going to rate ourselves, and we're going to go into detail in each of these 13 behaviors. This is why we have 90 minutes. And all of you have a stack of forms on the table. So how does this work? Well, we take one of these behaviors, and we have lists of evidence and counter-evidence of exhibition of this behavior. And what we normally do is we don't let people self-assess. We interview architects and stakeholders in the teams, and without telling them, because otherwise you get discussions, we only tell them afterwards, but we are scoring these behaviors on this scale of 1 to 5. 1 meaning this never happens in our organization or in our team. 2 meaning, okay, I have seen it happen, but only once or twice. 3 meaning, yes, some of the people do it in our organization, but most of them don't. 4 means, okay, almost everyone is doing this, but it's not yet ingrained in the organization. And 5 means it's a habit. So that's important, and this scale of 1 to 5 is also, you can find it also at the bottom of your radar form. And let's see. Okay, so this is the first slide. I have 1 slide of explanation for each of the behaviors, and then I'm going to ask you to look at the counter evidence and the evidence and see how does your organization score. So you have to make a decision now. What is the scope of the team that I'm going to do this exercise for? Is it just my development team, or is it my company as a whole, or is it anything in between, right? Try to decide that now so that you don't get any inconsistencies, and then at the end, if we have some time, maybe we can gather some of the scores, anonymized of course, and I'd be interested really in seeing if we can get some patterns out of those data. Right, so let's go to the first one, understanding context. Well, how do you know whether you are good at understanding context? The first thing here is that understanding of context does not come about by just reading stuff that other people have written down. There's this rule of thumb that 80 or 90% of all knowledge is called tacit knowledge. It's the knowledge that is in the heads of people. And as an architect, you need to know that stuff. You can never make the required trade-offs in your context if you do not have the understanding of the reason behind the things, the why behind the why, right? The question behind the question. So this is why you need to be able to talk to your stakeholders. And of course, if you want to talk to them, you also need to know who they are. So that's a prerequisite for understanding context. Ask why. And another good thing to do is to try to avoid a mismatch of vocabulary. Well, there always is a mismatch of vocabulary. Somebody says availability is very important to me. That doesn't really mean that much, right? What do you exactly mean? This is why the SCI has quality attribute scenarios, right? And those are basically little stories. And this is also what we want to understand the context of our stakeholders. We have to get them to tell us stories. And whether they are in the canonical format of the quality attribute scenario or more like a user story or whatever, that's of secondary importance, but they have to be narratives, as I call it here. And of course, you have to speak in your stakeholders' language. A few years back, the Best Presentation Award at SATURN was won by Jochem Schulenklopper. And the title of his talk was, Why They Just Don't Get It. And it's about learning the language of your business stakeholders if you want to be able to understand the context that you're working in. It's a great presentation. You can still find it on YouTube. All right? So these are some of the observations here about understanding context. Basically, this is stuff that you have all heard somebody at this conference already say. But now we get to the evidence that actually this is working in your organization. In your organization, when are the business stakeholders involved in the architecture? Is it at predefined approval moments? You first complete your architecture design and then you go to the business stakeholder and ask for a stamp of approval? Or are they actually actively involved in other architecture activities except for approval? Are delivery and operational stakeholders involved, right? or are they almost forgotten? Especially operational stakeholders tend to sometimes be forgotten. Of course, not if you're doing DevOps, because then you are the operational stakeholder yourself. But they often are the ones getting left with the technical debt. So they should be involved from the start. Architects communicate with business stakeholders in business terms, or are you using a modeling language exclusively, and are you trying to explain to your business stakeholders in the modeling language what you're trying to achieve and how their concerns are being met? Are you talking in terms of narratives or in terms of vague names of quality attributes? And do you have access to the stakeholders? Right? I have seen many examples of architects being forbidden to talk to some stakeholders. Is that the case? That's a piece of counter evidence for your maturity level. So based on this evidence and counter evidence, go to your form and try to, on the scale of 1 to 5, try to assess in your organization and write it in the effective stakeholder communication box there. Write a number between 1 and 5. And so are you mostly on the counter evidence side, write a 1? Are you mostly on the evidence side, write a 5? Something in between, choose a number. Shall I go on to the next box? Yes? Okay, good. This is the first time I'm doing this, so you have to help me a little bit along, and let's find the right tempo to do this. So the next one is context knowledge is managed. So we not only do we do the activities to communicate with the stakeholders effectively, but we actually also manage that knowledge in a number of ways. And here are, we validate it and we also preserve it for posterity. Here are some evidence and some counter evidence. Architects actively look for business goals and drivers, or are they based on a fixed set of documents without full awareness of the underlying business drivers? Specific architectural drivers and the business goals behind them are documented and validated, or no description of the architectural context is made, or it is made but not validated with the stakeholders. That's counter evidence. Give yourself a grade. Okay. That was about 20 seconds. Is that enough? Yeah? Okay, good. We'll get into the rhythm of this thing. Okay, so let's go to the next responsibility, which is making decisions. Now, making decisions has the most behaviors associated with it. So that will be the bulk of the stuff that we're doing. And, actually, this seems a bit trivial to me now to be discussing this because we have just had a whole session about architectural decision records in this very room. But I realize that not all of you have been there. But yes, the architecture document, capital A, capital D, is not your primary deliverable as an architect. It is sometimes needed, it's very often needed, but your primary deliverable should be your architectural decisions because they are a more fine-grained level of granularity of deliverable. And they allow you to have a quicker feedback loop to also, if you are looking at those decisions individually rather than as part of a big document that you're delivering, that allows you to also consciously time these decisions separately. Traditionally, the timing of architectural decisions, they were all gathered in a big architecture document, and that architecture document was approved after a month or after 2 months. And at that time, all of the decisions were basically made in one foul swoop. And what we're doing here is actually allowing ourselves to consciously do the timing of the individual decisions, which gives us a lot more flexibility and also a much better timing of those decisions. Actually, that's a separate behavior, the timing of the decisions, which I have a separate slide for. But first, how good is our organization or our team at at this. Do they still consider architecture as resulting in a big document and that's its primary deliverable, right? Or are the architectural decisions communicated individually whenever they are taken? And is the stakeholder feedback gathered only to review the collective architecture document, or evidence, stakeholder feedback is gathered on individual architectural decisions? Okay? Everyone graded themselves? All right. Let's go to the next behavior, which is associated with, I think, prioritizing those decisions. So we are using a thing called the architecture microcycle. If you look at architectural decisions as the primary deliverable, you can look at the process that delivers those decisions as resulting from a backlog of architectural concerns that have to be addressed by those decisions. So you first have to identify these concerns, based, of course, on your understanding of the context, research possible strategies, and then make the decisions. How do you prioritize this backlog of concerns? It should be prioritized by business impact, and not business value, by the way, because mostly we are worried about these things because they represent risk, or maybe they represent a lot of money or other value. So this is why we are prioritizing by risk and cost, which is why we call this approach risk and cost-driven architecture. So we get behavior number 2. Architectural work is prioritized by economic impact. Well, what is good counter evidence? Well, think of how your architects currently are prioritizing their work. I have seen many counter examples. For example, the documentation template. They start at, well, that's a bit exaggerated, but they start at chapter 1, and they first resolve the concerns that are described in chapter 1 of their template. Now, maybe chapter 2 is the security view, so then they start to address the security concerns. So they're prioritizing basically by the table of contents of their template, rather than first look at the concerns with the highest business impact. A second evidence of this behavior is architectural concerns and their priorities are clear to the stakeholders. Because if you prioritize by economic impact, then that makes it much clearer to stakeholders why you are spending time on particular stuff rather than on other issues. So that would be counter evidence if they have no clue about this. So think about your organization and give yourself a number from 1 to 5. Okay. The next behavior is about documenting those decisions, the topic of the previous session, including rationale, decision criteria, consequences, drawbacks, and alternatives. So how can you do that? Well, the previous speaker made a big point of not using a wiki or using Jira. So that's those are the 2 examples that I'm using. But I think this has, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that the place where you document your architectural decisions is the place that is easy accessible to your primary stakeholders. Now, if you are a pure play software architect, that place is definitely the code repository, right? Exactly like we have been discussing. However, if you are more an architect that is communicating primarily with business stakeholders, that doesn't make any sense. So you may want to use a nice wiki template, or maybe you use Jira or whatever. Find something that's easily accessible to them, and let everybody know you welcome feedback. So there's a comment box. That's the nice thing about a wiki page. Does the code repository have a comment box? Just teasing you. All right, so this behavior is architectural decisions are justified and documented. Now there's loads of evidence that you can look at, but the counter evidence, of course, is much funnier. So let's look at those. Stakeholders only see the effect of decisions after they have been taken in a set of views or models, right? Rather than that they are, explicitly visible. This is implicit. If the architectural decisions are implicitly visible only to stakeholders, that's not good. The justification is not there, or it is mainly based on generic principles, good design principles, and not related to the specific context. Architecture is context, after all. Only the chosen alternative is documented, or did we also write down what we decided not to do? And are the consequences documented as well, or are we just choosing, making a choice and then leaving it to others to decide what the consequences of that would be? So rate yourself on this. 1 means never, all on the counter evidence side. 5 means, yeah, we totally get this. It's already a habit in the organization. 3, what was 3 again? 3 was some people are doing it, some are not. The next behavior is about the timing of your architectural decisions. I already hinted at this when I said, the decisions are your primary deliverable. If they are no longer always tied together in a big document, then that gives you the freedom to time them individually. What is important in timing of architectural decisions? There's a saying in the Agile world that is quite popular: you should always take your decisions at the last responsible moment, right? And then nobody ever seems to ask the question, how do I calculate the last responsible moment? It's quite difficult. Actually, it's much easier to know after that moment has passed than before it has passed. However, which by the way is illustrated by this little limerick. It's not a limerick, no. Basically, this is a trade-off. Just like all architectural decisions, the timing of the decisions itself is also a trade-off. There's basically 2 things to trade off. One is the risk of making the wrong decision because you don't have enough information. That risk, of course, starts high because you start out with little information, and it becomes lower as you are doing your research. There's also, however, the cost of delaying the decision, right? There's usually a point in time where that cost suddenly starts to rise sharply. For example, because we need 6 weeks to order the hardware. So if we don't decide now which hardware it's going to be, or what am I saying? Nobody orders hardware anymore nowadays, right? We just do it in the cloud. But you know these situations, okay? The team has, they can't go sign the contract. Something, I don't know. So there's, and basically the timing of your decision is a trade-off between the risk of making the wrong decision and the cost of the delay of not making the decision. And of course, you need to be an expert at that as an architect. The most important behavior here is that we are consciously timing our architectural decisions. How do we know that we're doing that? Well, as I say here, it's a conscious process. How do we know we're not doing it? Well, we are letting the decision timing be dictated by project milestones or by agile principles. Yeah. We are also not doing it right if a decision is made because the deadline of the architecture document is getting close, right? That might be counter evidence. Instead of postponing it until more knowledge is available, if the risk of a wrong decision outweighs the cost of delay. So, give yourself a grade on well-timed decisions between 1 and 5. Okay, let's go to the next behavior. Where are the decisions made? Well, the behavior is called decentral unless. That's a little bit biased. I think I'm going to rephrase that as the decision should be made at the appropriate level in the organization, right? However, this decentral unless comes from, of course, this infamous sentence out of the Agile Manifesto: the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. And the word emerge here, of course, is the word that is most often misunderstood. People think that they see emerge and they think that it's magic, right? That they don't have to do anything. And the architecture, the best architecture will emerge, right? That's not what this is about. This principle is about self-organizing teams, about rethinking ownership of architectural decisions. And a few years back, I saw a presentation in the SATURN conference by Stefan Todt. He wrote a whole book about this thing called Crowdsourcing Your Architecture. Unfortunately, it is not available in English. It's only available in German. But he had this very nice picture as well. This is your classic architecture: broad standardization, hard rules, responsibility of the architect, and the rest is left open. And nowadays, we are more looking at architecture as teamwork, where we have an evolutionary architecture that leads to eventual integrity. There we go. We still have some hard rules because some things never change. But we have this gray area of suggestions that actually have shared responsibility between the architecture function and the developers. And this also means that the architects have to collaborate with other people. Oh my God. You mean that our success no longer depends just on us? It also depends on how well we collaborate with other people. Right. So that's a bit of a shock to some architects. So how good is our organization in consciously dealing with this question? Are all the decisions made at the right level in the organization? The right level of the elevator in Gregor Hopi's metaphor. You see here this spectrum, which is also due to Stefan Todt. Fully crowdsourced architecture means that our teams are just doing, making their own decisions. Nobody is called architect or anything similar. And all the way on the other side of the spectrum, we have the classic architect, also called the architect dictator, and they decide everything. And in the middle, there are a number of patterns that Stefan describes in his book. One of them is architecture owner, where, we don't have the classic architect, but we have architecture owners in the teams that have special expertise, that feel some responsibility and ownership of specific architectural concepts or specific components because they just know about it more. There's also architecture marshals, which is a little bit less ownership than architecture owners, but still we have people in the teams that administer or coordinate some changes, the more important or more difficult changes to certain components in the architecture. So now how do you see, how mature are you here? Well, the level of maturity does not depend on where you are on the spectrum. It's not true that, for example, fully crowdsourced is more mature than fully centralized or the other way around. No, a mature organization actually consciously considers these models and chooses the right one. One of my first customers was ProRail, with the Dutch railway organization, and they actually had all four of these in one organization. But in different domains, they had different levels of decentralization. For example, the management information or the business information domain, they had architecture marshals. What they were doing was not super business critical. However, in the logistics domain, which was the domain that actually made the software that decided how the trains would run across the tracks, they had a guy called Eddie de Boer. And, he didn't wear a tie. But apart from that, if Eddie said something, that's the way it happened. And because that was the kind of situation where you needed discipline and you needed a lot of centralized decision making because of the business criticality. Fail early and fail often was absolutely not an option there. So here you see a number of reasons why you would want one or the other of these. So how good is your organization at this? Do you see in your organization that an architectural decision is only made at the central level if the decentral interests can be conflicting or cause complexity that outweighs local benefits? Or are all topics mentioned in the reference architecture template made at the central level, no matter whether that's actually needed? Or maybe the other side of the spectrum, this is the waterfall wasteland, right? This is more the agile outback. All decisions are made at the decentral level because we are a self-organizing team applying agile principles. That's not very mature. Actually, an architectural decision should be made at the decentral level only if the benefits of local optimization outweigh the risk and cost of diversity and non-standardization. So, I think you have had enough time to think about examples of this in your own organization. Would you give yourself a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5? Okay. Let's continue. The next behavior, the next responsibility. So we have covered understanding context and architectural decision making. Now we are going to modeling, and there are two behaviors associated with modeling because there's basically two things you need to model as an architect. You need to model your environment and you need to model your solution. Modeling the environment we usually do in a thing called a context diagram, which is basically an architectural view that answers two questions. What's in scope? And what are the external systems that I have to deal with, right? Here is, if you look on Wikipedia, if you look up context diagram, this is the picture that you get. So this comes from the, I think, the American Weather Agency, or what is it? NOAA. Does anyone know what that stands for? Thank you, George. Basically, a context diagram has your solution or your object of architecting in the middle, and it's not necessary to show any internal structure. You're just showing the outside world. And that is a perfect way, basically, of visualizing, of modeling your environment. So, you can grade yourself very easily here. How often do you see a context diagram in your organization? Do you see it all the time? Is it almost unthinkable that a project wouldn't have a context diagram, or is it something that is never made? Or anything in between? Okay. And of course, the second behavior here is making visual models of your solution. Now, we are at the risk of a little bit of bias here because I am guessing that most of you are doing visual models because you are calling yourselves architects, right? Is there anyone who doesn't call themselves architect? Oh, actually, that's quite a lot. So maybe we get organizations that don't do visual modeling of their solutions. How do we make visual models? Well, usually we use views for that. All architectural standards have this concept of views. And a view basically is a way for an architect or for a design to show that particular stakeholder concerns are addressed. So the original, I don't know if he's the original inventor, but certainly the most famous is the 4+1 view model by Philippe Cruchten, where you have the logical view, development view, physical view, and process view, and in the middle the scenario view or the use case view. However, this has gone a little bit out of fashion, I would say. How many of you are applying the 4+1 views? Maybe more than a little bit out of fashion. But a different set of views, also 4, the C4 model by Simon Brown, is actually gaining popularity. Who is using the C4 model? Okay, that's only also. Okay, I'm wondering what the other guys are using.
UML.
UML?
Sequence diagrams, class.
Some of the things in there, but not all of them.
Okay,
Select
right.
application of the context.
Right, so that's actually a sign of maturity, is that you're consciously thinking of which views you should be using and which not. Of course, if you are using some of them because they are in your template and the others not because they are not in your template, that would be a sign of immaturity, right? But if you're actually consciously thinking, who are my stakeholders, what are their concerns, and how could I express in a model that those concerns are being addressed, that's a sign of maturity. All right, so here we go. We have appropriate visual models of the solution. So just enough, not too many, right? That is actually the first counter evidence. All the knowledge that you have is actually gathered in architecture documentation. All the viewpoints that are in the catalog are in there because they are somehow in the past were added to the template, right? A second counter evidence, diagrams are only used to clarify written documentation rather than the visual modules are actually used to validate that key stakeholders' needs are fulfilled. Visual models are used as the basis for creating and delivering solution rather than models are used to get approval and then abandoned. That happens too much in some of the organizations that I come into. Yeah, we have architecture models. We had them at the beginning of the project. They may have been a little bit old now. Visual models are made at the appropriate level of abstraction to allow reasoning about the architecture, or they're only created at prescribed levels of abstraction. So, what is your grade? Okay, those are the two modeling behaviors. Let's continue. Validation. There's actually only one behavior here, which is the architect or the team checks whether the architecture fulfills the stakeholder needs. Right? That's what you do validation for. It's not enough to actually validate, but you should also act on that, on the results of that validation, right? I have seen too many projects where that had gone wrong. I usually get called into projects only when they go wrong. So I have a terrible track record in project success. But the project has gone wrong. I asked, didn't you make a prototype and validate the architecture? Oh yes, we made a prototype. It was in the project plan. I said, can I see the prototype report? We didn't make a report. Was the prototype successful? Did it prove that the architecture worked? No, there was problems with it. Okay, so did you stop the project and... No, there was no time to stop the project. We had a deadline, right? So if that's the way you deal with prototypes, why have a prototype phase at all? Just because it's in your project plan template, right? No, all of these things you have to think about consciously. Maybe the whole maturity thing is only a level of, it's just a matter of using your common sense and rather than the rules to do stuff. Okay, so how good are you at validating? How good is your organization? Do you have a clear validation moment? And do you repeat that validation? And does that validation include all the architecturally significant stuff rather than just functional testing? Okay, let's move to the final responsibility, which is fulfillment. And here we have a lot about how do we implement our architecture? Does the team deal with the architecture? What is in the backlog of the team? And we are using here this model by Philippe Kruchten. And actually, Matthias showed a version that was 90 degrees rotated of this, and it had an iceberg in it to distinguish the visible from the invisible stuff. I really like that model. It also implied, by the way, that the invisible stuff is usually much more than the visible stuff, which I don't know if that's a good thing. Anyway, so the model basically says that there are two types of stuff in your backlog. There's the stuff that's visible to your end users, like new features or bugs. And there's the stuff under the hood, beneath the surface. That's not visible to your end users. It is visible to the architects and to the developers and stuff. And here we have basically two types of stuff, with positive value and with negative value. The stuff with positive value we call architecture runway. It's basically the architectural structures that you need to be able to develop this functionality more efficiently. And things like message buses or infrastructure, that kind of stuff. And then there's a technical debt. Technical debt, how do we know something is technical debt? Well, we have had a whole session about that this morning, but the easy way to remember is, are you paying interest? This stuff that is in your backlog, as long as it is in your backlog, are you running specific risks, or is delivering the functionality actually a lot harder? In that case, you're paying interest. If you're paying interest, it's debt. It's black rather than yellow. By the way, for those of you who cannot see the colors clearly, this is yellow, this is green, this is red, this is black. So, are Rod or IPEC here? I don't think so. No. I reviewed their book on technical debt that they have just this week released. And in the first version, this idea from Philippe was not in there. I couldn't find it. And so in my review comment, I said, why is it not there? Because of all the things that you have taught me, this is the stuff that I get the most positive feedback on. And they say, well, of course we want it in there, but do you know how expensive it is to print a book in color? It did end up in the final version, but these are shades of gray. And there is an explanation beneath there that one shade of gray is green and one shade is red, etc. So remember these colors. This is an excellent model to reason about what's in your backlog, also with your stakeholders. So how does this work then in, for example, a Scrum team? Well, we have a backlog with all the colors in there. And we have a sprint backlog, where at the end of every sprint we decide what goes into the sprint backlog. And if all goes well, if you are a mature organization, actually all the colors make it through. If you are a naive agile organization, maybe your product owner only allows the green stuff to go through because they have been taught to prioritize by business value, and only the green stuff has the direct business value, right? So that would be a sign of immaturity. Remember that architecture microcycle where we had our own backlog of architectural concerns and the architectural decisions? Well, that's the process that generates these yellow and black things. The architectural decisions lead to new components, new work, new architectural runway, and technical debt that needs to be remedied. So that's how mostly the yellow and the black stuff comes in there. Where does the other stuff come from? Well, it comes from, of course, your stakeholders. And your stakeholders give you the business stakeholders, user features and defects. And so they all end up in this solution backlog. And you see there's an arrow here that your architectural concern register or backlog is actually filled as a result of these user features and that are requested by the stakeholders, right? The stakeholders ask you to make an improvement to your solution. And as an architect, you take a look at that and you're saying, hey, wait a minute. They ask for something green, they think, but actually there's a big yellow component in here. because this functionality isn't as innocent as it looks like, right? My favorite example of that is time travel, right? It's where the stakeholder tells you, oh, this is a great report, but I would like to have a slider on my screen where I can actually go back 3 months and then print this report the way it would have looked 3 months ago. That's time travel, right? It looks like a very simple addition to the function of writing the report. However, it has a deep architectural impact because it means that you have to certainly do work on your database, your data structure, and a lot of other stuff as well. Sometimes you miss them. You miss the architectural impact and significance of the green stories, and you only find out when the team is working on it. This is where the daily stand-up meeting, for example, and the architecture microcycle, which are both daily processes, touch each other, and you can use actually, of course, the team also as a source of architectural concerns that have to be addressed. So this is an example of how you can combine all of that together. But what's important is the behavior. What's important, for example, is the first behavior in fulfillment. Work on architectural runway is recognized and planned. So what is work on architectural runway? It's the yellow stuff. It's stuff that is not visible to end users, but it's absolutely needed. How good is your organization at recognizing that stuff? And it's important that it gets prioritized correctly. You know, if the team or the product owner decides what goes into the sprint backlog, how do they do that? Do they only prioritize by business value, or do they actually have a reserved amount of capacity also for these enablers, as they are often called, right? Is the ownership of these yellow and black, or the yellow things in this case, is it clear, or does nobody take ownership of that? It's also good if the whole team takes ownership, right? I'm not saying here that one particular person should make it. It should be clear, but it may be, of course, the whole team. So, what score would you give your organization for recognizing work on architectural runway?
I think you maybe said it, but the term on the previous slide, the architecture microcycle. Can you say what that is again?
Right, the architecture microcycle was, I touched on it briefly a while ago.
Okay.
It's all the way back here. It's basically your decision-making cycle, right? So you identify and prioritize architectural concerns from your stakeholders or from the team. You get a backlog of things that you have to address. You do research for possible strategies, and you select one, and that becomes your output, your architectural decisions. That's the architecture microcycle. I'm not saying that you have to have an architecture microcycle, but if you have ownership of your architecture, you probably have something similar. Where are we? Yeah, here. Okay, are we done with this? Everybody gave themselves a grade. We're almost through. How am I for time? Huh? Half an hour left, excellent. Okay. So, the next one. It's about architectural debt. So what is architectural debt? Well, it is a form of technical debt. It is the most pernicious, is that a good word, form of architectural debt because it's not visible in the code. It is the technical debt that is there because there are structures between modules that are not working correctly, shortcuts that have been made, also aging technology. Those of you who attended the technical debt session this morning know exactly what I'm talking about. This is what was called enterprise technical debt by Felix Bachmann and Stephanie. So one of the most important things here in signs of maturity is that the technical debt or the architectural debt is visible to the business. And how do you do that? Well, probably not by calling it technical debt. This is, I think, is one of the misunderstandings, is that business people think that technical debt is a technical problem because it's in the name, right? It's not. It's a business risk. You know, it's their functionality that runs the risk of not being able to be produced anymore, or of being produced very slowly due to the technical debt. So you can put it on a risk register. You should find business owners who feel the pain of the risk, and you should make business cases. You should actually translate the whole discussion, the whole conversation about technical debt in terms that the business owners understand. That's kind of difficult. So the behavior is architectural debt is identified and controlled. How good is your team at that? Are these debt items are visible on the product backlog or on the project schedule? Or does it only contain stories? This is over-grooming of your backlog, only contain stories that add direct business value. Are the decisions to fix that architectural debt based on economic trade-offs, or is it only fixed when there is time left after implementing all the necessary functionality? How are these prioritized? This is a particularly nasty one, I know. Who of you are using SAFE? Okay. Oh, it's this table. Okay, good. Okay, that's nice. So do you use WSJF, weighted shortest job first prioritization for your stories? No?
We always have a theoretical explanation, and then everyone says yes, and then we try it 1 or 2 times, and then it's done.
Yeah, good. So this is for the rest of you, if you ever run into WSJF, and I think SAFE is past its prime now, so the risk of running into it is getting lower. But this is a theoretical way of prioritizing stories based on business arguments, exactly like actually I'm asking you to do here. The only problem is that in the way that this is done in SAFE with planning poker cards, somehow the architectural debt and also the architectural runway stories always end up at the bottom of your backlog because they're underestimated. And SAFE knows this, by the way. If you look at the SAFE website, they actually tell you that you should actually reserve capacity for these enablers apart from the WSJF prioritization. However, that information is a little bit hidden in the SAFE website, so not everybody understands this. Okay, sorry, I got off track here. I think everybody has had time to assess their maturity of architectural debt identified and controlled. Let's go to the final one. Just enough anticipation. How far into the future are we watching? And what do we take into account? So, before I explain this picture with all these same colors again, there's basically 2 anti-patterns here. One is the waterfall wasteland anti-pattern, which is we look as far as we can. We are building a future-proof solution for eternity, right? That is the traditional way of doing architecture. Future-proofness is one of the first things that we worry about. The other way around is more in the agile outback, is where we are only allowed to look 1 sprint ahead. And if you look further, what is the term that you immediately get yelled with? Huh? Yagni, exactly, Yagni. You ain't gonna need it, right? And that actually ends the discussion, right? So those are both anti-patterns. And what you should do actually is you should think about this using common sense. Basically, what this means is that you have to do a dependency analysis. The only way to anticipate is if you know, first of all, what are the things that are going to happen in the business and in a technology context that will impact, my solution. And of course, what is needed for that is understanding context, the first responsibility that we talked about. And then you need to know how all of these things depend on each other. Like here, for example, the competitor releases a very nice next generation version of their product. Well, that is an event that will impact our own product, and we need to have this feature here in place before they actually release the next version. However, our dependency analysis has shown us that there's a piece of architecture runway that we actually need to be in place, otherwise this feature will be almost impossible for us to create. And so these types of reasoning is what you need to, and we call it architecture road mapping, by the way, is what you need to establish just enough anticipation. So, once again, this is a method of doing this. I'm not asking you if you're using this method. That's not the only way that you can do this maturely. I'll give you the evidence and the counter evidence in a minute. This way of road mapping, by the way, allows you also to reason about these patterns and anti-patterns again. For example, here is a strategy, value first road mapping. We start with all the green stuff. And just build the user functionality as quickly as we can. You see the value curve of our solution going very steeply up. And only after a while, if it really is necessary, we are building some architectural runway and dealing with some technical debt. Of course, we may have a little bit more technical debt if we do it this way. But there's tremendous value actually on the steepness of this curve, because we are able to show our stakeholders very quickly, and they can use actually our solution very quickly. One risk, of course, with this approach is that stakeholders experiencing this line, if you don't do expectation management correctly, they will think that this will go like this, right? And who can blame them? Because they see the team starting off and it's, oh, we have such a wonderful team, they have such great velocity. Of course, we already know that this is going to happen. So we must tell them. We must tell them here, listen, dear stakeholders, we are going to show you something terrific, but it's not going to last. Because. And if we don't, what will happen is that the stakeholders will start to get very upset here. Not only will they get upset, but they will also tell you that all of this is your problem. They are going to be unwilling to pay for the black and the yellow stuff because they think that they're only paying for the green stuff, right? So they're saying, oh, that's not from our budget, right? There must be some IT budget that you can use to fix these things.
I actually expect that slope to keep increasing too.
To keep increasing, right. You mean like they're getting steeper, yeah. Yeah, because the team is still learning here, right? Yeah, good point. Of course, if you are working in a very volatile environment, this is an excellent strategy because you have so much value already so early, right? And this volatility can be in the business environment, like we are in the business world that is changing very rapidly, or it can be in the technology environment. If you're using, I don't know, JavaScript, probably what you're producing now is going to be superseded by the next fashion in 6 months or so, right? So it doesn't make any sense to do a lot of upfront design and architecture framework building. It's going to be legacy really soon. The other side of this, of course, is architecture first road mapping. We start with a big piece of yellow, the architecture framework. And in the first iteration, all we produce is one very small function, hello world. And then very slowly, we start building more green stuff. As the architecture becomes more and more perfect, we are adding more functionality. And of course, here, our architecture is finished. And it's so good that we can produce green in a huge at a huge velocity. We don't even have to code anymore. It's just more configuration, right? Adding new functionality. So good is our architecture. So this is great because we know that we are going to have, most of the life cycle of our solution is going to be here anyway, and we will be set for a great future. The risk here, of course, is that the green line stays below the red line for a long time. And if you don't do good expectation management again, your stakeholders are going to say here, I don't believe in this project anymore. It's just costing us money, right? So you need to be aware of that. And of course, if you're in a volatile environment, maybe you have to throw away all of this because it has been superseded by some new technology. And yeah, so that's the other risk here. Which of these is the right one? Well, you know the answer. It depends. Probably you want something in between where you actually reason about the order rather than prioritizing stuff just because it's yellow or just because it's green. Okay, so the final architecture fulfillment behavior is architecturally significant features, events, and stories are anticipated. We are doing this when teams work with stakeholders to identify future events that impact the solution. Counter evidence, we are not working with them, we just hear it at the last minute, right? Taken by surprise. We are doing well if the dependency analysis is used to start work on the architecture runway in time, and we are not doing it well if we are actually always too late at starting, or actually too early. It might also be a problem, starting with architectural work. And this timing is actually a conscious decision, rather than only implement enablers when they become really urgent. A few months back, I did a workshop with one of my clients, and they had become so, how do you say it? Desperate is not the word, but resigned to this, that they say, okay, we have given up hope of fixing technical debt before it actually explodes. We just wait until it explodes, and then we know that we get the attention of the business owner, and then we can fix it. Of course, it's much cheaper to fix it before that happens, but it's too hard, right? That's a sign of immaturity. So, your organization, your team, how mature? Be honest to yourself. Okay, so now we have all of these boxes filled out, the little boxes, and the next step is to translate the little boxes in the big boxes, right? And the question is how to do that. Well, this requires a little bit of a judgment, right? I know that it's not right to just take the average, because usually the low scores have much more impact than the high scores. So if, for example, for architectural decision making, you have 3 4s, a 3, and a 1, then probably you are not the average of that. The average of that would be something like 3, but you probably would want to give yourself a 2 there. So take a few minutes and try to think of, in all honesty, how would I rate, given these numbers in the small boxes, how would I rate the big boxes of the 5 behaviors for my team or my organization? So let's see if we can identify some patterns here. From just walking around, I don't know. I see a little bit of confirmation of the patterns that I noticed in the organization that I worked with, which were waterfall wasteland. You're heavily slanted to the left, usually with a big spike in validation, right? That's all we do. We just approve the architecture documents, and that's it. Okay, who of you, this part we are going to cut out of the recording.